Thank you all for being here. I am Shiva, and I'm going to be moderating our Artist Roundtable. We have two Iranian-American artists speaking today, Ali Banisadr and Pouran Jinchi. And in preparation for today's panel, I did studio visits with both of them last week, and we have determined a set of questions that we're going to ask each of them. And we're going to begin by asking them to talk about, in the beginning, how they became artists.
So for me, it began when I was quite young. It started when I was probably around 3 or 4 years old, when living in Iran during the revolution and the 8 Years War bombing that was happening. My mom tells me that I would make drawings based on the sound of explosions and the vibrations, and in a way, for me, it was a way to sort of try to make sense out of what I was hearing, since I wasn't witnessing it. And this sort of sound into visual elements kind of stayed with me to this day. Fast forward, moving to California. I left Iran when I was 12. So in California, living in Northern California, I started to do graffiti art and studying psychology. And at the same time, I was trying to make the work that I make now in my studio. I reached a point in year 2000 that I felt like I wanted to go to art school and sort of internalize technical and conceptual teachings. And that's when I moved to New York. And during my graduate school, second year of my graduate school, this whole time that I was in school, I had decided that I wasn't going to make any of my own sort of work. I was just going to kind of put that on hold and just learn as much as I can. And then second year of my graduate school, I had a residency to Normandy, and I visited the D-Day site. And when I was there, I felt that there was something familiar about the remnants of the World War II scenes that I was witnessing. And I had sort of a flashback of what I had witnessed in Iran as a child. So I decided to go back and kind of start making work that was based on sound again, as I was making them when I was a child, but this time using the sounds of explosions to sort of create the visual landscape. And the work that I'm making now sort of grew out of that.
Thank you. Pouran, would you like to tell us about your beginnings as an artist?
I was born in Mashhad, So anyway, I was born in Iran, a city called Mashhad, which is northeastern part of Iran. And my experience growing up in Mashhad was, it had a culture of, even though it's the second largest city in Iran, it's a very traditional religious city. So it had a culture of a small town. So I think we all have an effect of where we grow up and our experiences as a child. I came to the United States in mid-70s to go to school. I attended George Washington University, and I actually studied civil engineering, not necessarily my own choice. My desire was to study arts, but my parents made sure that that's not the route that I take. And then revolution happened. I was supposed to go back, and I never did. I guess life circumstances and events sometimes provide you with certain opportunities in life. It takes away some things and it gives you some other things. And it gave me the opportunity to become an artist, and I continue doing my work. I can't really say because revolution happened, I became an artist, but a combination of all those events brought me to this point.
So now each of the artists, Ali and Pouran, are going to take you through some samples of their work and kind of give you a sense of what kind of art they do.
This is an earlier painting. It's 2008. I was trying to make, I've always been interested in making work that it could be 2 or 3 things at one time. So for example, in this work, I wanted to create a scenery that could be, it could be a masquerade, but at the same time, it could also be like a religious experience. And we don't know which one it is because of the stained glass windows there. So I like this play between having the work be read as read as theatrical versus a serious issue. And as I've mentioned before, sound has a lot to do with my work. That's how I'm able to kind of compose the work, but I'll get to that later. This is the Charlatans, 2009. I sort of moved on from using the geometric elements in my work, and I wanted the work to be more organic in a way. And there's always a lot of figures in my work that you don't necessarily see them, especially probably from this point of view, but they're like small figures in the work that once you spend time with the work, they sort of unveil themselves to you. And I like this idea of having things be in motion and not having it the central focus, having everything sort of, having your eyes sort of move around the painting and just find things as your eyes moves around, and sort of not letting your eyes kind of move out of the painting and just kind of circling back in. The figures are always metaphorical. They represent real social situations. Sure, yeah. I was just looking for that if the size was there or not. So,
They're big.
yeah, it's like, well, this is
huge.
This is like 82 by 120 inches. More than that.
The arms work well for me.
Yeah. So for that reason, because they're large, there's a lot of body movement at the beginning. It's very gestural at the beginning. It's very abstract. And then slowly the narrative kind of starts to take place. So when I begin, it's very abstract, and I don't have any any drawings or references. It's like a very organic process. In this particular work, it's called "We Haven't Landed on Earth Yet," which I was reading the de Kooning biography, and in there was a quote from him that he mentioned that he was alluding to the man's first steps on the moon, which he was saying, we haven't even landed on Earth yet as like human beings, as compared to the moon. in spite of like all the incredible technological and scientific advances, they remain bafflingly primitive and unrefined. This is just a detailed shot to give an idea of all the figures and elements that are in the work. Well, you know, because when I work, there's a lot of getting really close to the work and getting far from the work. So I continually go back and forth when I'm making these. So they're meant to be seen in that macro, micro level. This at the time was my largest painting, 96 by 180 inches. It's a triptych. And this was commissioned for Venice Biennial for a show that was titled Love Me, Love Me Not, which was about an Azerbaijani artist and its neighbors, the Caucasus region. So I decided to do it based on Farabashi, who are guardian spirits mentioned in the Avesta, which is the Zoroastrian book. Because I feel like I realized that all those regions have Zoroastrianism in common, so it's like they have a deep root with this. So this is another detailed shot. This is the central panel. So the painting then traveled to Baku in the Haydar Aliyev Center last year. This is 66 by 88 inches. At the top part, I was sort of trying to create some kind of a text. I'm interested in creating like ancient texts that are sort of like codes that don't really say anything. I think in the video we watched yesterday they were talking about that, which was quite interesting. In this particular case, I was thinking of Code of Hammurabi, was a huge influence. And also, I always make sure that I don't refer to, I try to stay away from showing certain signs and symbols that we're very familiar with, because I feel like those always come with a baggage. And I like to create sort of new symbols that they have some kind of you're familiar with them, but they're not really pointing to anything. They might be pointing to several things at once. They can't be categorized easily. And I always like this sort of half awake, half asleep sort of moment to try to kind of capture that from my imagination and create that for these landscapes. This is the largest work I've done. It's 24 feet across. It's 7 meters across, and the height is 60 inches. And I kind of wanted to concentrate in this case on the material world, just because my paintings usually at the bottom part of the painting, that's where the weight, that's where you have the figures. They're always it's humans, animals, machines, and gods, and that's where the chaos is. And as you sort of go to the midsection or the top part, is where you could possibly find some hope or some release from this material world. But in this case, I wanted to really concentrate on the material world and concentrate on the figures, so the figures became quite large. This is the left panel of the painting. And my interests vary a lot from every culture, be it Japanese art, Persian miniatures, or Hieronymus Bosch, or Bruegel, I mean, the list goes on, but I like to sort of internalize these and sort of have it come out the way it does. Like I said before, I don't look at any references or anything, so it just sort of work its way into the work naturally. This is the central panel.
My work is really drawn from Middle Eastern cultural references, cultural sources, and I also bring my own life experiences into all these influences. And so my life experiences are really the first 18 years of my life, living in Iran, growing up in a religious city, and moving to the United States in mid-70s, and basically being influenced and being an adult in the West. So I bring all that experiences into my work. I am a trained calligrapher. Growing up, I was trained as a calligrapher, and I didn't always start my art as like calligraphy art and text into my art. I experimented with many different styles, but what I do really I kind of felt like I'm not really comfortable with 100% Western style, because it kind of didn't feel real for me. So I started experimenting, and because it was natural to just go back to something that I already knew, which was calligraphy. And I worked on that and basically developed my style, which happened over many, many years. This grouping is basically a grouping of the Persian alphabet, and I was inspired by the fact how familiar Persian alphabets are to me and how unfamiliar they are in the West. And I kind of wanted to give the Persian alphabet, give it a visual experience. And but at the same time, I wanted to use a material that conveys like a childlike material that you would use growing up at school. And I used Elmer's glue and ink to make this work. And they're all very small. They're 5 by 5 inches, and they're just many groupings of them in black, turquoise, and red. And this was one summer when I was very fascinated by trying to learn printing, and I spent the whole summer learning how to do etchings. And so this is one of the works from that summer. It was very fascinating to me because I do use text and calligraphy, and with etchings and printing technique, I kind of had to reverse that. And so that was kind of challenging and new to me. And this work, in this book, I'm using prayer stones. Prayer stones are these baked clay tablets, basically, that I guess Shia, I didn't know this, but I learned this later. Shia Muslims, when they pray, they use this, it's called mo. They use this to place their forehead and do their prayer. And where I come from, obviously, Mashhad is a very religious city. This is a very popular item to sell to tourists and people that go visit the shrine in Mashhad. I was very interested in all the shapes and different calligraphy and patterns on these moors. And I asked my family to send me a bunch, so I have a great collection of all these moors. And the way I do this work is I place more underneath paper and I do charcoal rubbings. and I keep moving the tablet and more underneath the paper to create a composition. And sometimes I use like the border of it, sometimes I use the middle. I just pick and choose what I use. This is done also with the same technique, but it's done with the Whitechapel. And then I also add my own markings and writings and markings on it. This work is based on Quran. Obviously, you can all see the influence of where I grew up. I use a lot of religious text and items, I guess. This is a rendering of Quran on very large scrolls. I have kept in this work the name of the verses, all the numbers, and all the critical markings, and I've taken out the words. So that is. And this is one of my poetry paintings. I use a lot of poetry and sometimes even novels and stories in my paintings. This is from a series that I did that is called Entropy. The layers of the text, and they're just layers and layers of the poem. The same here. This is from the same series. And this work is the actual prayer stones that I used to do the other drawings that you saw earlier. And I kind of recycled them, and I painted them in lacquer. This was for a show actually at MFA Boston, which is called White. It was about how blue and white throughout history has been used, where it originated. Actually, I learned that cobalt actually comes from Iran, and it went to Iran. They did pottery with cobalt, and then it traveled to China, and the Chinese were they were masters of pottery, so they used cobalt and created a whole porcelain, the concept of blue and white. And then it traveled to Europe, and of course Europeans did their own thing to it, and then it went to South America. And at this exhibit, there were a lot of works from different countries, different artists, Western, Eastern, and this was my installation for that exhibit. And this work is also based on Quran. I have written layers, basically the whole book, 605 pages of it. It's the Quran that I have that belongs to my mother. And there are layers of writing on plexiglass with Sharpies. And the sides are painted with stained glass paint because I wanted to give it a sense of transparency, to just create an architectural shape that portrays enlightenment and also transparency as well.
So the last question that I've asked the artists to think about is to tell me a little bit about their life in the studio, both in terms of their art practice and to talk to you about their current projects that they're working on.
My old studio, new studio now. So as was mentioned earlier, the process always begins very abstractly, and it's using sound. So as soon as I begin the work, there's a sort of sound that begins in my head. It's not a sort of sound like a music that we know, but it's a sound that sort of comes from the painting itself, and then it allows me to sort of compose the work. So it's sort of a guiding force at the beginning, and then from that, the narrative sort of come about, and everything that I'm sort of, when I'm not painting, I'm doing a lot of research that fuels my work, or things that I'm reading, sort of, and find their way into the work organically, intuitively. new project. So I have a show coming up in November 21st at Today's Showpack Gallery in Paris. I might push it back, but need more time. But that's always the case. But that's the next show.
So let's see if this works. Okay. So let's see if we can make it well, no. Okay. You missed my cinematic debut. Taking a cell phone photo of cell phone film of Pouran's studio. But due to technical difficulties, sorry, Martin Scorsese, my filmmaking debut. Yes, Pouran, do you want to talk about your studio?
Sure. What I'm working on right now is I'm working towards an exhibit, upcoming exhibit in September at Leila Haller's gallery. And this work is based on a book that is called The Blind Owl, by a modernist author, Iranian author, Sadr Hedayat. And basically, it's based on 3 different components. I'm making drawings, sculptures, and paintings. And I'm practically fragmenting the whole book. Sometimes it's a paragraph, sometimes it's a whole book, sometimes it's just the dots in the text. So each work will represent kind of the fragments of the book.
Brilliant. So do we have time for some questions from the floor?
Just a few.
Okay, time for a few questions, comments.
Why is the size of your painting so large?
I'm going to be polite. I'm not going to comment.
I have a big studio.
He is an Iranian man.
Actually, they vary in size. I have works that are like 8 by 10 inch as well. But I think in the large works, what I like about the large works, I'm able to sort of expand the narrative as I want. It could just keep going with it. Where in like a small painting, it becomes more like iconic. You have like just one figure to work with, and that's it. Where in the larger work, I could just sort of move around more. You know.
The scale matters. You're trying to create a whole chaotic world. So.
Yeah. But in every show, I have many various sizes.
It's really amazing because when you see the work from this, it looks so abstract. And it really took me having Adi show me, you know, when he walks you through the detail. And so you think about the scale of these works and then you look at the detail of each individual character. And he can, they're not incidental. I mean, they're organic, but they're not incidental. He can tell you stories about each of the characters.
How long does it take you to finish like
A long time.
This painting took like 3.5 months. But when I say that, it's like I say 3.5 months, but then it still sits in the studio for another 6 months, and I go back to it, like little things here and there. So it's usually, it'll be like 95% finished, and then it'll stay in the studio until it's really finished.
Madam Judge, you have a question?
Yes. Your painting seems to be extremely dynamic, and there's a lot of movement and energy emanating from them. Are you very, very energetic? And is there a lot of physicality in the manner that you approach your paintings? Are you moving about all the time and up and down? And is this quite chaotic?
I don't drink coffee. No, well, yeah, at the beginning it is, but on different days I have different moods, you know, like there's a day where I go in and I'm all over the place and my studio looks like a mess, and then I have another days where it's like I'm in a miniature mode and I'm just like working on one small area, and I like this sort of balance between having it be so energetic, but at the same time you could get close and look at something in a miniature kind of way.
Lodanjan, you had a question.
Yeah, I was, well, first one of the first things that struck me looking at your work while you were speaking about it was this micro-macro balance, and then you immediately used those words as well, which is great, and I think it helps to hear about the process and how your palettes were emerging. And it's great to hear that sound or music or however you want to describe it plays a role, because your work is very rhythmic. And what I think is really, now I'm getting a little bit confused looking at all the images at the same time. They're just going.
Ignore me.
Oh, it's actually. If you don't mind bringing it back to one of his, where I can sort of. Yeah, that's fine. Yeah, no, I know. But well, in the ones where we just see the painting, what's really great about them as well is that there's also a lot of texturing. So this layering and texturing I find really fascinating. And yet, even though there's the chaotic element, I see it seems very clearly threaded together, in a very purposeful way. So at some point, is there a moment where that comes out to you? It sort of emerges from the painting where you say, okay, now I know that this is going to be a squiggly line here, or this figure is emerging from that. Do the figures emerge from the sort of more less sharp, from the not focused part of it? Do they emerge through that to you, through colors or through textures? I mean, is there a moment at which you then know, now this is what this is?
Yeah, I mean, at the beginning it's quite abstract, and then slowly as I'm working on it, like I'll start to see the next thing that I need to do, which is a reaction to the next thing, and so on. So that's what just like keeps the whole thing moving on a good day, where everything is a reaction to the last thing, and so on and so on, and then these sort of these hybrid figures kind of start to emerge, and they start to sort of make sense with each other, and the narrative also is like a reaction of one part of the painting to another. So everything just kind of like starts to tell me where to go and what to go after.
I think it's a real great juxtaposition. This is what because I want to join it.
Lodanjan, I'm sorry. We're running out of time.
Okay.
We're already running behind. Does anyone
question for her.
Does anyone have a question for Pouran? Pouran, question for Pouran. Do you have a question for Pouran? Go for it. Sorry. There's someone who actually raised their hand. Please go ahead.
So in the last panel, we heard a lot about how politics just kind of became something that was unavoidable. Do you ever feel that pressure, particularly since you do so much religious material, or is it something you've been able to avoid and just focus on the art?
I think I pretty much know how to self-censor, so it's automatic. So I don't really even have to think about it. I just know the boundaries. So because I do use a lot of religious subjects, I don't mean disrespect, but I also need to question as an artist. So I just do my own self-censoring, and I've been getting away with it so far.
Yes, in the back.
I just wanted to ask, you both have very specific color palettes, and can you talk about your choice and use of color in your work?
Mine is really depends on the series that I'm working on. Sometimes my palette can be very muted, just black and white, or muted colors, and sometimes they can be really, really colorful. My material and colors, they always say something about the subject that I'm using.
Can you talk a little bit, Pouran, about the colors of this new series that you're doing? They're very specific.
The new series that I'm working on, which is based on the Blind Owl book, I'm looking at the book from a point of view of, it portrays a lot of pain and violence, and I'm trying to keep my palette kind of limited to what are the colors of violence, and if pain had colors, what would those colors be? So I'm basically staying with, like, for example, like, what are the colors in a bruise? So that's one reason I'm using like a lot of pinks and reds and purples and blacks and for the new series.
And blues. And Ali, you actually read books on color theory. That's a really important part of your work, right? That was meant to be a question.
Well, no, I mean, I don't think I make the choices based on that. I mean, those are just like research for trying to understand color. But for me, it's more like a mood that I'm kind of after in a work, but that doesn't necessarily end up being the color that I choose at the beginning. Like, for example, I could choose the painting to be red and it ends up being green. It's just a matter of like where it wants to go and what makes sense. But currently, I actually made a conscious choice to it's not the black and white painting. Anyway, that I made a conscious choice to use the color of geography of like where I reside in Brooklyn into my work. So I kind of made a conscious decision to make note of what colors surround my studio or when I walk around, and just kind of sort of use those colors just as an experiment.
Thank you very much for joining us.
And we are going to move on to the next panel in just a few moments, so I would ask that you please stay seated for this one. We will have a wonderful lunch break just after this panel, so please stay seated.
So welcome to the panel, which is titled Emergent 1. So from was it Resurgent? From the Resurgence to the Emergence. My name is Omar, and I'm moderating this panel. One of our panelists, Raza Shabout, is actually on this machine here. She is a hologram. This is the great thing about technology, and we are very grateful. And Nada is with us here, and we have her name tag here and everything. So we have Raza Shabout, Sara, Vasilis, Oikonomopoulos, and Raza Akbarinia, all on this panel. And as Lisa mentioned before, everyone's bios is on the program that you have there. I guess what I wanted to do is just to quickly outline the context of what this discussion is about. And really, the contemporary context for Middle Eastern art is often dubbed as one that is emerging not only in terms of its market potential, but also in terms of the relationship between museums and institutions, particularly in the Western context, but also locally. And by this, we're talking about the context by which research and knowledge is produced. So how do museums and institutions collect works of Middle Eastern art, and how do they integrate them into their broader collections? But also, how do university professors construct syllabi and courses for university and higher education institutions, and who is the audience for those programs, and how do they engage with them? And what is the research and output that is being produced from these various platforms? These are all things that we're going to discuss today. And the format is going to be that I'm going to hand over to everyone to say a few words before breaking into a bit of a discussion and conversation. But I just wanted to, as a kind of way of context, just say a few things to kind of get us going. And one is to say that although everyone here on this table, myself included, represents a different institution in one way or the other, whether it's University of North Texas, the Whitechapel, the Guggenheim, the Tate, the British Museum, where we are all affiliated to, as I hope has been kind of obvious from the discussions this morning and yesterday, is that the pursuit or study of Middle Eastern art is very much a personal thing for so many of us, and I think that it's very much the individuals within the institutions that frame those discussions. And as we've come to realize, it's often very much a personal journey, a personal act of reconciliation that leads us to these kind of lines of inquiry. And certainly for myself, I often talk about this, is that as an individual studying in an education institute in the Middle East, I was surprised that the art historical figures of the region were not ones that I was taught, and that began my line of inquiry. But also just a few other comments, which is to say that within this sphere of discussion that there are a lot of kind of complexities around the terminology and the nomenclature that we use. And even in our discussion so far, we've seen a kind of interchange of the use of the terms modern and contemporary. And one thing that I want to say, actually maybe a slight corrective to a statement that was said yesterday within the film, which is that an artist in the film, Campbell, I believe might be his name, mentions that modernity was happening all over the world at the same time. And that's not necessarily true. Modernities happened at different times in different contexts, and I think one of the things that we're doing here at this moment is discussing histories and their own localized genealogies and their own specificities, and then broadening them out into a wider context. So I think it's important to articulate that specificity. So without further ado, we're going to begin this panel, Emergent. I'll start with Neda, who's going to discuss and answer a series of kind of questions that we use to frame the discussion. And yeah, so I'm going to, Neda bas lahza, I'm going to move the mic to you.
Okay.
You're in the room and you're live.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much for facilitating this, and Omar, and thank you Liz, Shiva, and Miriam for hosting this great symposium. I wish I could have been there in person, but I guess a hologram is better than nothing. So to respond to some of the questions that we received regarding the issues that Omar just introduced, I want to talk a little bit about the development of the field from my own perspective, which is, of course, academic. So there seems to be this misconception that academia was lagging behind in terms of making spaces for the field, that, particularly the market, as well as the museums as well, but particularly the market was kind of leading in various ways as, there seemed to be more events or more things happening. But the reality is, and I'm someone who started studying modern Arab art in the 1990s, the reality is academia has been engaged in the study and the scholarship of art of the region for much longer than its appearance in the market. But unlike the market, financial restraints at academia and museums as well are very different, create very different conditions. So meaning that, it's easier for a market for a quick turnaround, you sell the work, you make money. It's immediate. But for academia, to actually plan these courses, you have to make sure that there will be students taking them. You need to have the money. We always have budget cuts, of course. I understand. I'm sure the market has its own ups and downs as well, but it's a very different sort of situation. The academic and museum sort of spaces require a long-term planning. However, we should also remember that actually, although I'm not going to speak about museums, there are many representatives on the panel who would. Venetia Porter at the British Museum started collecting modern and contemporary art from the Middle East, albeit it was mainly work on paper to work within her institutional policies from the 1980s. So, and I've often talked about my experience, studying the field, but I should also note that, I have started teaching modern Arab art as soon as I started teaching in 2002. So I've suffered a lot through the challenges of not finding a program, which ironically just now, 5 minutes before calling in, I was answering an email of a student who wants to study, to do graduate work in the field and does not know where to go. And like Omar said, in many ways it becomes a personal thing, because what I tell students, find sympathetic, and interested faculty who would lead you, at least methodologically. Because when I was applying for graduate work, I was given the option of either going to Islamic art or Middle Eastern studies, which of course I did not want to do. But the reality is, and I hope someone talks more about this, or maybe something we can, get back to it during Q&A, is that the market specifically, when we talk about a market of art, the market started mostly in the Gulf region, and when the auction houses started opening offices there, which means it followed the money where the money was in the region, the new region, albeit. Academia, on the other hand, is actually here in the West, where we actually have financial problems, and we are not necessarily being funded by the region. So the situation is very different, and of course the biggest problem is that there is no programs that are teaching art history in general. They're very new ones in the region, but specifically, the Arab art. So what that does in kind of in relation to the question about that the background of most curators in museums, or even actually, in academia, is either Islamic art or Western art interested in some modern and contemporary art of the region, is that it somehow, there is a very interesting situation, particularly in museums. I'm always baffled how major Western institutions do not seem to mind hiring so-called specialists in the field without, for example, a PhD in art history and enough experience, which they will not accept in any other traditional departments. Things are changing, but the reality is that there is a dearth of PhDs in modern and contemporary Middle Eastern art. So in terms of how it shapes the curatorial practices, well, it depends. Could either be very interesting if it aims to work out the connections and ruptures within the context of the regional development and modernity and later notions of the global, or of course it could be a very sort of skewed to a shallower reading of the practice. There are various examples of both sides. But in terms of the naming of the field, and we have Minam and Wanasa, and they're all very interesting, and they all reflect a certain engagement with the region specifically. And, as an art historian, I know that we can't do away with generalities, because it's very difficult to speak about something if we don't allow ourselves a sense of generalities. The one thing I'm concerned about is that we seem to not differentiate between the modern moment and the contemporary. I think all these namings and classifications work better for the contemporary, because the dynamics of the sociocultural dynamics have changed from those in the 20th century. The artists' nationalities and artists' transnationality has changed as well. So the challenge is not to assume that these terms and connections work across the two periods. The main implication and problematic would be false affinities and continuities and other form of homogenizing, like, talking about putting the contemporary with the Islamic works, but the modern with the Islamic needs a little bit more debate. And I'm sure many of you have heard me often talk about all these unresolved problems of modernity specifically. And it's really interesting that at the moment we're going back to the notion of modernity, but from a completely different context and point of view of what we were talking about, scholars of modernity. And scholarship is stronger in terms of studying the modern as opposed to the contemporary, although most of our students seem to be interested in the contemporary. And at the moment, I'm actually reading Tariq El-Aris's Trial of Arab Modernity, which actually offers a new methodology of even looking at the visual. His is mostly about literature, but I think, there are the interesting contemporary, and the notion of the global and transnational brings about different interpretations for the modern vis-a-vis the region, because it did have, different developments. Okay, and for the last point, and I have lost track of time, is that in terms of infrastructure development that I would like to see, and I would leave the notion of museums and other institutions to my co-panelists, but as an academic, I believe the field needs more research, more scholarly publications that addresses details, themes, historiography, and not only a general framework. Thank you for listening, and it's kind of very interesting that, you're all just sort of, because I can't see you, you're all just listening, so.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That was not a Shabout of her a provocation, her statement, and I think it was the main key point there is that is another chart, the kind of periodization of when research in higher education institutions began in terms of a Western context, but also is lobbying for more discourse and more original research to take place in the field, and also the tension between the modern and the contemporary as fields of practice and fields of study. We move on next to Sara Raza, who is the UBS Curator for the Middle East and North Africa at the Guggenheim, and also Head of Education at YARAT, and also a writer and editor, and a PhD candidate at the Royal College of Art. Actually, two PhD candidates at the Royal College of Art. I don't know if Shiva approves of our British PhD system. I'm also, anyway. I think what's interesting is one of the things that we're also discussing here is mapping out the context and the confines of the region. And Sara, you have two, I suppose, specialisms in that you're interested in not only the broader context of the Middle East and North Africa, but also Central Asia and the Caucasus. And I was hoping that you'd be able to talk us through a little bit the kind of work that you've been doing in relation to some of these themes that we've outlined here.
Thank you, Omar. Firstly, I'd like to thank Shiva, Mariam, and Lisa for organizing this conference, and thank you all for being here. Your question is very relevant, Omar, and especially some of the points that Nada also discussed just now. In terms of the way museums and academies are shifting, I think it's largely due to the fact that in order to remain relevant, I think that much of this infrastructure is now aware that it must be acute to global debates and current thinking. And our world has shifted, and I think that this is very, very important. And education being a very important component of that in terms of what feeds into curatorial practice, what feeds into syllabus, what feeds into the higher curriculum. I myself teach as well, and ironically I taught at Sotheby's Institute for over 4 years as visiting lecturer on the modern Middle East, as well as the making of contemporary art practices after the collapse of the Soviet Union in Central Asia and the Caucasus. So these are diverse fields, yet one thread that runs common is that I was looking at the idea of modernism elsewhere, not modernity occurring on par with the West, but occurring within its own particular timing and sensibility, which is a very important point. I know that you also just argued that a short while ago. But in terms of geography, one can look at the world in many ways. We can look at it purely by cartography, we can look at it through migration, we can look at it through ideas. There are many ways of mapping. I mean, the title of my current role at the UBS is Map Curator, which is part of a larger project that is looking to shift the Euro-American centric dynamic of the Guggenheim's collection, to make it all-inclusive, to look at artworks from a global perspective rather than looking at them purely for geographical purposes. So that is a very important shift, that these works that I am currently working with that will form part of the main collection. They are not part of the Abu Dhabi collection, they are the American collection. So it's very important to say that a new history is emerging. And this is also obviously what Citizen is doing in the Tate as well, how this is shifting. But in terms of all the various components that bring this history, this scholarship together, there's writing, obviously. Omar, you write yourself. I have been writing for over 14 years. I've been working with Art Asia Pacific magazine for over 13 years as an editor for West and Central Asia, meaning Middle East and Central Asia. So it's been very important that, that there are archives emerging, whether they are in the form of an exhibition catalogue, in the form of an exhibition documentation, articles, reviews, profiles as such. It's very important that this is part of a wider remit.
And can you just say a little bit more, perhaps, about very particularly the context of the difference of collecting Middle East and North African art for a regional museum or context, and thinking about the collection at the Guggenheim more broadly? So are you thinking very particularly about the holdings of the Guggenheim at this moment and how conversations can be staged across different histories?
Well, I should like to point out that we have a very strong history of like a canon emerging of modern Arab and Iranian art and Turkish art as well through the Abu Dhabi collection, which has already established that dialogue. So with my particular project, it's going to be looking more contemporary over the last 2 decades. It is not necessarily directed or dictated by a particular history, yet histories. I'd like to stress that it's in a plural sense. And there will be a lot of ideas-driven notions as well, and more ideas around science rather than purely geography. This is an important point. So I cannot disclose too much just yet because I'm still within the research phase. However, I'm looking at more scientific theory and ideology within this practice rather than looking at purely geography. Much of my projects deal with science and theory, less to do with geography, although I do obviously upon 2 particular remits of the world. However, I try to look at them through various lenses rather than purely positionality.
Okay, thank you, Sara. We'll come back to and have more discussion. I'm going to move on to Vasilis, who is a writer and curator who works particularly on the international collections at Tate and also a PhD candidate at the Royal College.
Thank you. Can you hear me? What I want to do is I will continue a little bit with the discussion that Nata and Sara started, and also kind of one of the questions that we were asked to look at was the idea of the concept of giving names and attributing names to kind of to the work that we're doing. And as Nada said, there's all this kind of Menasa, Menam, Mena, which is kind of somehow for me it's interesting to see that this kind of non-fixity of a particular name and the instability of a particular name is kind of signifies the fact that the region is in a constant process, and the constant fluidity is a kind of a constant process of becoming something rather than being something which is static and known. And that's really fascinating because we understand as practitioners working for museums that there is a number of aspects and a number of notions and concepts that are still affecting and they still have a major impact to the work that we're doing. And this is what we try to do with Tate particularly. We try to understand all these kind of histories and moments and practices that have been, for various reasons, lesser known, and at the same time that have been influential, and they can provide a transformative experience, not only for a Western audience, but for an international audience. And for example, certain aspects of what we're looking at is the network of biennials that emerged in the 70s and the 80s in the Arab world that somehow complexifies the understanding of the international biennial. And if we can start thinking the international biennial has been theorized more in the 90s and the decade of the 2000, we kind of try to understand that there's been moments in Tehran, in Alexandria, in Istanbul that have been more kind of important and key and significant to what was happening in the West. So that's kind of one of the aspects that I would like to talk about. So Tate is the international, the national collection of the United Kingdom, and it's one of the most important collections in the world. And currently, the holdings of British art and international art are almost of a similar size. Tate Modern exists since 2000, and we're quite proud that in the 15 years since its inception and the realization of such a museum, we have managed to kind of create an international art collection which is as significant as the British art collection, which has started 130 years ago. So it's kind of in a period of 15 years we have produced a really significant and important international collection. And this is a little bit showing how the structure of Tate works. And at the core of the processes and the procedures of Tate is the acquisition committees, which is a group of people who are interested in all different parts of the world, and they have extreme knowledge of how art has developed and what art can do. And it's interesting, I just want to mention that the acquisition committees, although they have a strong geographical kind of like Remy and they work geographically. However, there's an intense porosity between each one of the data acquisition committees, and the way we function as a kind of like international monitoring group, which is another kind of acronym for what we do. All the acquisition committees, the curators who work in every acquisition committee meet on every 15 days, and we discuss research and processes and moments and artists that we have been looking at in order to try to find what are the connections that are not as known, and to try to understand what are the kind of like the narratives and the histories that we'll be able to tell by acquiring specific works, and also how to kind of like complexify and further amplify the strength of our international collection. And in the last, again, as I say, in the last 15 years, we have been quite prolific and trying to acquire significant and key works. And at the same time, similarly, the level of research has brought us to understand that there is a world which is the connections and the multiplicity of realities is so extreme that we probably will never be able to understand it. But as a global art museum, we are interested in kind of like trying to identify these moments that will offer us a different perspective. And this kind of like idea of constantly like also being critical to our previous work is also a way of like expanding our perspectives and the angles that we can have when we approach particular practices and particular historical moments. Particularly with the collection, Tate has from the beginning was a museum that avoided a historical and kind of like a linear display of its collection. One reason was that the collection, when Tate started in 2000, we didn't have the holdings, for example, of the MoMA, that had an incredible collection of abstract expressionism, or the Pompidou, that had an amazing collection of artists that lived and worked in Paris. So we try to think of how this disadvantage can actually become an advantage that can be more relevant to the way that things were being kind of like processed at the beginning of the new century. And we kind of like the idea of bringing different works from different geographical areas and from different moments together. It's a kind of way of rhizomatically looking at how dialogues can be created. And that kind of like opened up ways of people engaging more and try to think more how things emerge, how concepts and ideas became relevant, and they were kind of like in exchange with each other. And another thing as I want to mention, although we work geographically and the Latin American curators work in Latin America, and the Middle Eastern North African work in Eastern North Africa, when works are being accessioned, the geographical location doesn't become part of the work. It is then a work of the international collection. And that's quite important because kind of like it's something that you mentioned also, Maria, breaks down the boundaries of thinking locally and it kind of like opens up the way of like thinking globally. And it's also quite true, how can we pinpoint someone who, for example, was born and worked in Egypt, moved to Copenhagen, and until the end of his career worked in Paris or in London. It's very difficult to kind of like position it geographically when the kind of like the moments and the ideas and the exchange of ideas and the production applies to a number of layers which are not necessarily there's not necessarily a geographical beginning and an end. And this is a recent display which has gone up 2 weeks ago. And this is a work which was acquired last year in the Middle East, Africa, by a Lebanese artist. We're quite proud of the fact that we try to display works within 1 year of their acquisition. This is something that they were not limited by the historical trajectory, by the kind of like the linear timeline, and that allow us to bring work, to constantly change the works that are on the walls or on display, to bring new dialogues to spaces that have already kind of like have a definition. And this is a gallery which is called Making Traces, the thematic of the entire gallery, and includes works that have kind of like look at the gestural and the bodily action as a kind of like the translation on the final on the outcome of the work. And this is a painting by Gaston Safika in the middle and John Mitchell. So it's interesting to see this kind of the Lebanese artist who's largely unknown in the Western kind of context, being presented alongside again John Mitchell, David Smith, and at the end a mural painting. So it's just interesting that these kind of connections and can create new kind of meaning. Another very important display for us is the work of Salou Arauda-Suker, which is in the Structure and Clarity display. Salou Arauda-Suker is another Lebanese artist whose work was again largely unknown until a major retrospective at Tate more than 2 or 3 years in 2013. And the research that was done for the retrospective also amplified the kind of like the understanding around their work and their practice, and that also led to many of the works being acquired subsequently by Tate. And this is the beginning of a gallery which focuses on Tate's holdings of abstract art, but also minimalism. And we begin by saying the story of abstraction through the work of Middle Eastern female artists. And this is also quite important, that our commitment doesn't stop necessarily the geographical aspect, but also the kind of like the gender plays an important role. And it's really crucial to kind of like amplify the fact that there was very strong female practitioners that have really saved the history and the development of art in the Middle Eastern context. Again, this is another painting by Salou Arauda-Suker in this particular context display with the work by Naum Gabo. And it's very interesting to see the connections, the kind of like the configuration in the composition at the back, and this kind of like structure of the three-dimensional work at the front. And it's the same work in the bigger kind of perspective, which is shown alongside Barbara Hepworth and Malevich. So it's just for us, it's interesting to bring you know, these voices into a wider dialogue that can really kind of like produce new kind of perspectives and new types of meaning. Further down in the same gallery, the work of Monet Farman from Mayan is being shown just before the room of the minimalist, where Donald Judd, Albrecht, Gerhard Richter, also work by Hans Heike, Frank Stella are also in the same room. So it's interesting to see how the relationships between an Iranian artist whose work has been really instrumental and really particular has very strong affinities with what was happening in the American context. And then following this, we have a really beautiful, we display a very beautiful video by Kader Attia, which again is from the work is a 2007 work, and it really produces many layers of critique to many systems and many kind of like understandings about art. First of all, maybe sugar and oil as resources and as kind of like economic factors and financial aspects that kind of like gave, or even to Tate, provided the support that made Tate what it is. Tate was the empire built on sugar trade. And again, at the same time, really complexifying the understandings of what it means, how the white cube as a space for the display, and how the white cube as a kind of like, as a dominant modern contemporary paradigm for the display and presentation of art is kind of collapsing, is being transformed, is being turned into something else. Something quite similar to what the minimalists were trying to do in a way, when the minimalists emerged out of the kind of like dissatisfaction with the continuous dominance position of abstract expressionism. So it's interesting to see how all these kind of like theories and narratives can actually coexist and can actually like offer unlimited perspectives and kind of like offer kind of multiple points of view towards what practice can do, but also what art can do as a register in society in general. And a beautiful work that was recently on display in the gallery. Do I have more time? A few more minutes. Transformed Vision was Lia Lazawi's monumental painting, Sabra and Satila Massacre, which was presented in the gallery alongside Leon Golub's Vietnam too. And here again, this particular thematic was focusing on the developments of the new image of the man that followed the kind of like the end of the Second World War and a state of continuous global conflict that never ended, basically. And it's interesting to see how monumental work by an American artist and a monumental work by a Middle Eastern artist are really such a strong dialogue between them, and they produce an incredible effect and have an amazing impact to audiences. And the work, Azawi's work was then replaced by Raza Artisans, another monumental series of photographs, Execution Square, which looks at the kind of Damascus and Aleppo as a place of trauma and conflict, and kind of that. And again, it's interesting to see how these two works are producing new kind of ways of understanding. And the same kind of thinking runs across our different programs, so it doesn't really necessarily stop in the way that we collect and we display work, but also in the way temporary exhibitions are being devised, and to kind of, and this is for us a very particular moment where we had two retrospectives of two significant artists, Roy Lichtenstein and Salora Audasukiera, running alongside, and this is the galleries of the Salora Audasukiera exhibition, and it's quite remarkable to note that the Salora Audasukiera show was the only show that was extended for 6 months at Tate Modern. There was no other show that the demand from the audience was as extensive that we had to extend it for 6 months. We had probably 3 times more visitors than we could imagine, and also presented us with the fact that the London audience is thirsty for this kind of exhibitions, is thirsty for new material that would provide new kind of perspectives, and something that they have never experienced before. And again, we hope to do exactly the same thing with the World Goes Pop show, which opens in September, and we will be including 12 works by Patrice Tanavoli. The wonderful sculpture will be in the exhibition, but also a series, one of the carpets, and I think a series of 6 screen prints. So I hope you can make it into the show.
So we're going to move on to Mladen, who's the final speaker on this panel, who comes from a slightly different context in that you're working in an encyclopedic museum and have had 2 different experiences working in an encyclopedic museum, first at the Brooklyn Museum and now at the British Museum. And you're a curator of Islamic art there now. And we're going to pass over to you to give us your provocation.
Thank you. I'd also like to join my fellow panelists and Omar in thanking Mariam and Lisa and Shiva for organizing this and for inviting me to come out. And I think at first I was a little bit surprised that they asked me to come because I've been working more with the more historical parts of the collections at the British Museum. And over there, my remit is really to look after the collections of Iran, Central Asia, and India from the Islamic period forward. And then I have an overlap with my colleague, Anisha Porter, when it comes to contemporary. But it's really the baby that she brought up almost from its inception, although I should say that the very first contemporary work that came into our collection was a donation by Michael Rogers, who's a specialist in mobile painting, and that was in 1985, and this was a work by a London-based Egyptian artist named Ahmed Mustafa. And so she will always say this as well, that this started in the 80s, and then, of course, her exhibition Word into Art then kind of led to this blossoming of the collection, thanks to a lot of patronage by people such as Mariam Eisler, who, the Eisler Fund is not just at Wellesley. We're really happy to have one at the British Museum, which has allowed us to collect many works, especially in the last 5 years, I would say. So that's been really an incredible opportunity, also to find a post for somebody to look after that material. So we have that as well. I think I'll just also try to answer these 4 questions that are based on the development of the field, of how we view it, and I'll also say that we all have our different ways of coming into this field. I have a BA in art history and French literature with a minor in Italian, and my focus was on the Hopi Kachina doll for my thesis, and I was I think I wanted to come into studying the Middle East, and specifically Iran, because I was inspired by works of Shirin Nishat's Women of Allah series. So this is in 1995. I did my first master's at UCLA, and I did my thesis on her work. But I was told, both by people I was studying with there, even my dear colleague Linda Komarov, who's thankfully really doing a lot for the contemporary field right now, that it was going to be very difficult to follow that line academically, and if I'd never be able to get a job, and yet still very encouraging of my research. So I decided to actually go back and work on the kinds of things produced by dead people, and I really do like working on that material. And I found that it, I did an internship and fellowship at the Metropolitan Museum, and that made me realize I wanted to go into the museum field. I felt that there was more of a chance to connect with the wider public, but I really appreciated having this historical foundation. And I focused on the Mongol period. And what I like about that period that I find resonates today with contemporary work is that there is a fluidity under the Mongols, and there's this large umbrella that connects these various regions. Okay, there was a lot of violence, there's a lot of, a lot of pillaging, a lot of killing, but the artists and the skilled craftsmen were really held on to because they could help produce more works. And by bringing these various artists and skills together in these regions that were patronized by the Mongols, we have this blending of different styles. So there was this globalism, obviously, existed long ago. And I found that when I was a graduate student, I got my first job at the Brooklyn Museum while I was still finishing up my PhD at Harvard, which is where I ended up going next. And I found that I was interested in working with the whole collection. I was taken on board as the only curator to look after the Islamic art collection. But I was really moved by some works that, a work actually I saw at Leila Heller's gallery, and that was a work by Sadegh Tirakan. And what I liked about his work was that he was combining the aspects of tradition with a very modern way of presenting them. And so my introduction to the material, or reintroduction to the material coming back to contemporary, was really through a visceral reaction. And so when we look at how is it that we're collecting, or how is it field developing, I think fields in their earlier stages may take on or start organically. And I think it's important to recognize that in any collection, much of what is displayed or how the collection is divided is driven very much so by the content, the works that exist in the collection. Perhaps a large number of objects that came as a donation to a museum. So even encyclopedic museums aren't necessarily neatly divided. Look at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. You have chronologically driven departments, geographically driven departments, and medium-driven departments in musical instruments. So I think keeping those in mind, I, at the Brooklyn Museum, had the chance to acquire Sadegh Tirakan's work, and I'll come back to that. But mainly, the way that we worked on this type of acquisition at the Brooklyn Museum was to have conversations with any curator who would be able to speak about the artist. So there was it would have been irresponsible of me at the Brooklyn Museum to take on this work without speaking to the photography curator that we had the opportunity to consult, and also the contemporary art curator. So we worked together, and we saw that the work, as you said, it's part of the larger collection, and I think it's really important to view it that way. And I think as we move forward, the more collaboration, the more communication we have with various specialists, we're now so connected and so fluid that I think we require that collaboration to be able to get at the most that we can out of pieces. So I'll also move to the British Museum, where I am now. At the British Museum, I worked mainly on the traditional parts of the collection, historical parts of the collection, but about a year ago, or 2 years ago, I was asked to curate two large rooms that were going to serve as a transitional space between the main part of the British Museum, the Great Court for anyone who's been there, and then a new exhibition space, the Sainsbury exhibition space, which is now the home for new temporary exhibitions. And so everyone will walk through these two rooms to go into the Sainsbury Gallery. And so these works needed to have some type of relationship both to the museum, but they're the works you pass as you go into this other space. So I came up with a what is the way you can connect any object in the British Museum to another one? And so I chose thresholds and the idea of transition and perhaps that could mean transcendence, or that could mean moving from the profane into the sacred, or vice versa. But the museum experience offers that to people, and it can be interpreted by different people in different ways. So this is showing you, because we are here for the Tenabuli exhibition, I thought it would be nice to show one of the two heaches that we have in our collection at the British Museum is now in a semi-permanent display in one of these two rooms. So in this room, I had suggested putting, I would have loved to use the big red heach that we had, but it was much too large for this space, because you can see how high this goes with the ceiling. And what I loved about this piece was it is, a nothing, a cage to nothing, in a building housing so many somethings. And in fact, it is a something, and you can sort of play on the words like that. But for me, every object had a role. Every object had to somehow connect to this idea of transition or moving across thresholds, but it also had to speak to the other objects. So if you could just press so here it is. Now you're looking, if you go right, you'll go into the exhibition space. If you turn to the left, you see the light is going into the great court. And you can see the heach from the great court, but I couldn't get a good shot of that to show you. And then just across heach, he's sort of looking, she's looking at us, but also at Nandi, the bull. So in bringing an Indian sculpture, a Hindu sculpture, that is the bull on which, this is the bull on which Shiva rides. Each of the Hindu gods have a mount that they can be transported from one place to another, and he often sits in front of temples and marks the transition from profane to sacred. But here he is marking that transition, but they're also speaking to each other. They both have this sort of organic look. They both have a very sculptural dimension to them, but made of stone and made of bronze. And then they stare straight ahead, and you can barely see this. There's a Rashid Qureshi sculpture, which is which we can't, unfortunately. I don't have a closer view of that one. And then a work called Copper from the Hood, which is by a Native American artist based in Canada, and harks back to traditional hoods that were ways to show displays of wealth within the community. So all of these works, they could speak. Can we go back one actually? Or is it just moving itself? Yeah, you just stay here. All of these works somehow could speak to each other, but also be a part of the collection. So I didn't choose this work because I was told show a work of Iranian art, or work of Middle Eastern art, or of Islamic art. It was what is a work that could be representative of the collection, can stand within this space, can speak to other objects, and can hopefully encourage people to go to other parts of the collection because they become interested in these works. And I think that's a great opportunity to look at these works within that sort of context. And I did the same if we go to the next image. I think if you go forward, so if you, one more. Oh, okay, sorry, I thought there was another. If we go back to the one with the red walls. At the Brooklyn Museum, I had another opportunity to look at the work, contemporary Middle Eastern art in a
I'm really not a tech person. Is there something?
That's fine. I'll just quickly, yeah. Basically, what I wanted to show you next was just a couple of slides from an exhibition that I did at the Brooklyn Museum called Light of the Sufis. That was another opportunity in which contemporary art participated in that, not really to go through an entire exhibition and then show today, reaching the contemporary period, but to show you that each object again had a role within this thematic, under this thematic umbrella. And I think the theme allows us a way of looking at the works in relation to each other and giving them a dialogue with each other that is very interesting. However, as collections build, we also have the opportunity to show either retrospective or to show how they fit chronologically or geographically. And I think each of these has an important role, but my experience has been to bring these and weave these into another project. So here, this was a very small exhibition, but I'm showing this painting. There is the Hajar painting, which depicts a story that has connections to Sufism, and all of these works works had some sort of connection or dialogue with Sufism, even though they wouldn't necessarily be called Sufi art. But I commissioned Pouran Jinchi to produce one of her prayer stone pieces. So if we go back one, you'll see the work that juxtaposed that painting. And this was her. Yes, and I talked about this in terms of the Sufi act of zikr, where you repeat God's name and other sacred phrases. And the way that she had just done this circular composition, it just fit perfectly with the show. At the same time, we had another work by a Brooklyn-based artist, which at the Brooklyn Museum, that was another mission, is to really feature a Brooklyn-based artist. And so Kelly Driscoll had created this laser-etched book sitting in that case right there. And the next slide should show that close-up of verses of Rumi's etched into these glass page, and it's called Fragments of Light too. And so there was an opportunity also to include that work. And at the Brooklyn Museum, those did have a place in the so-called Islamic collection, because they had a dialogue with the collections. And at the British Museum, the strategy is to collect objects that speak of their time. And that is more Middle Eastern-based artists, or they're more directly connected to the Middle East than someone like Kelly Driscoll, who in this case still had a role within the collection. And I think I'll just end with saying there's an important communication that exists with other national collections in the UK. So the Tate has its own strategy for collecting. The British Museum has a strategy for collecting works on paper, because that's what we're able to do there. We don't have the space, we don't have the capacity to grow a collection in this expansive way where we can include video. How will we preserve it? Everyone is sort of, what do we do with video? We've had conversations about this, people are up in arms, and yet once in a while something will just be so important that we'll try to push it through. And I think it's important to be collecting not only within your institution, but in dialogue with other institutions, and to support each other within a city and then globally as well.
Thank you so much. So I'm just going to ask a couple of quick questions before opening up to you guys for your feedback. So this conversation or set of discussions has really been also a lot of organization, how institutions form the kind of roadmaps, as it were, to understanding historically arts of particular contexts and regions. And we have a kind of very different set of examples and case studies here. And I was wondering whether, from your experience, whether there was this preference for this, it seems as preference for the kind of integration of Middle Eastern collections into a broader international collection, or are we, by doing that and not necessarily focusing regionally, do we risk potentially missing out particular figures potentially? And I'm trying to be polemical on purpose to say, if we don't create or accrue a kind of specificity around genealogies, do we risk losing particular bits of information? So, for example, could there be a confusion by taking a Shafi Aboud out of context and out of the line of, say, when you show Shafi Aboud in that context, you don't know that the reason that he moved to Paris was he was escaping a conflict context, and that his work actually relates very directly and particularly to an experience.
Even then, we have templates at the end. You have to fit everything in those things. And I work with material that has writing on it that I think is really important. So I will make the font smaller if I can until I get caught. So, and I understand their point of view too, because you only have a certain amount of time, and the attention span is only so much for the audience. But if it's a special project or a special exhibition, then I think that's the opportunity to juxtapose, or a temporary display or a short-term display. Then that allows you, and again, coming from within an encyclopedic background, I would say those are the moments where you can focus on something specific. Because otherwise, there's so much that you could glean out of these works, and a different person who's using them will be using those works for different reasons, inspired by them.
Can I just talk a little bit about it? Because you mentioned the particular example of Shafi Aboud, and this is something that is quite interesting, because the work is on display. The work kind of like refers to this particular moment. It's a kind of like a opening up the way to look at the work from the moment that he left Lebanon, and he kind of like, he brought the particular color palette into the kind of like the development of informal painting, informal, and the kind of like the gesture really goes back to his memory and the traumatic experience of kind of like leaving his country and going to Paris. But to the other question, are we risking losing a very, very important piece of information, or kind of like leaving something behind? I kind of think that so maybe sometimes I hope we don't include everything, and I do hope that we don't include everything in order to be picked up by someone else. I think it's kind of like this. We should try to kind of like avoid the hegemonic kind of way of the major international museum of the Western country, and that by leaving something, it's also becoming a kind of like a stepping stone, or a kind of like another node to be continued by someone else, particularly, specifically in places and cities in the region where this kind of like knowledge is necessary to kind of like to be amplified.
Sara, Jen?
I'd just like to add on what you were just saying, that public programming is the most essential component to add the elements to, in particular, the education. Of course, a certain degree of editing does go into curatorial practice, but I agree, sometimes some elements of an artist's historical journey is extremely relevant to point out, but I feel that this discourse gets handed over within the educational frame, and that is where a lot of these discussions can take place. Given the fact that we're all here, this exhibition that we are part of is Parvistana Voli, but yet our discussion is so fluid and so broad, and this is another great example why education is so important in terms of curatorial practice. A lot of curators believe that the moment the show is up, it's over, their job is done. I feel that's just the beginning.
I mean, my follow-on question from that, which Neda, I'm gonna bring you in on this, was what do we think about the concept of the regional show or the regional group show, because it's been such a phenomenon in the West. So last year we saw the New Museum here and Elsewhere exhibition. I was invited to create a similar initiative earlier this year. In the UK, we've had exhibitions from Unveiled at the Saatchi to Light from the Middle East at the V&A, which is the joint collection of the British Museum and the V&A. And what do we feel about these things? Do we feel that they create urgent need and space for discussion, or do we feel that they potentially homogenize practices? Because there are a whole range of things that or polemical questions that these things raise. So maybe Neda, I can, as an art historian, maybe you could give us your perspective on that.
Sure. The pragmatic in me would say all of the above is needed and necessary because of the lack of space or voice of the region. I mean, we like to think of ourselves as global and international or whatever you want today, but the reality is, for any student who takes an arts history survey class, will not learn anything about the Middle East. There's one chapter in most of the books that speaks of the Islamic world, which I've often said to my students, it sounds like it was happening on Mars, not on Earth, because it's not connected at all in the developments around it. So I think while the museums or the galleries and the curators are trying to globalize the presentation of the region, art history, unfortunately, has not been decolonized, let alone to become, to be globalized. I'm teaching currently a course called Becoming Global, and after going through various theoretical readings and exhibitions, and students going from various directions, I tried just simple exercises of decoding works that the artists do not know. We used to do this as a sort of part of the master's degrees exam, to give them works, unknown works, and so they need to sort of place them somewhere. And, it would be extremely difficult for my mostly, Western students to really understand what this painting is talking about, because they will not know the knowledge behind where to position it. So their point of reference will be, if it's a modern work, it will be modern European. If it's contemporary, it's, something they know. So they will always use the comparative method. And so unless there is more knowledge about the region, it becomes very difficult to become sort of global. So I'm always I want the art of the Arab world, of the Middle East, to be accepted and understood as, you know, an equal within a large global sort of, you know, trespassing geography and ethnicity and what have you. But at the same time, I feel if that happens, if we jump into that moment immediately, we have never really allowed the region to even go through the fumbles of identity and everything else. So it will have some sort of a, you know, a knowledge, a context before it becomes globalized. So it's really a very challenging and difficult situation. And I think it's both. We need the sort of regional shows, but we need also sort of the specific, the one artist show that allows for more contextualizing. I mean, there's no easy answer. I think it's just the multiplicity of all these efforts, the wonderful efforts that all of you are doing will lead into something better. We have classes we're teaching, you know, our students are interested, we're having this conversation. It would have not even been a dream in the 1990s. So we're doing something right.
Thank you, Nada. Do any of you have anything to add to that particular comment?
Just a very quick comment. Just to say that Tate Modern is particularly opposed to regional exhibitions because the commitment of Tate is focusing on particular practices, and also I think by focusing on particular regions, we kind of like run a risk of thinking that the interesting moments or the interest in the region started at a particular moment in time. And I think, you know, by avoiding or by kind of like not doing that, we kind of like, our interest is widespread in the region. It hasn't started just now in a sense. So, you know, there's a difference there somehow. It's kind of like trying to avoid the trend, producing a region or a trend towards looking at the region.
I think I was just going to add to, I really liked Nada's emphasis on the importance of education moving forward and having more programs. I mean, in some ways it's a shame that it's wonderful that Shiva's more actively curating, but a shame that the academy loses you because you've had a great following of students that I even know about and I've never taken a class with you. And there are other, and of course, you know, Nada, thank goodness, you know, in academia. And I think it's hard to try to encourage people when you don't know where to send them, and then there's an issue of funding too. So I think I hope that there are more efforts and initiatives for education, and I think in some ways that what's happening will lead to that, because then everyone will focus on that. But also, I think it's important as we move forward, whatever we do, whether it's a regional show, an artist-driven show, and then I was talking about how we have to look at permanent displays. And we're talking about this now because we just received funding to reinstall our galleries by 2018, and the difference between that and temporary displays and what you can do in them, but also collaboration with colleagues, other scholars, and then other regions as well. Nasser Rabat was talking to me about this too, about the importance of communicating with people from the regions that are being represented and trying to make sure that the voices that appear also represent those too.
We have to open up to questions now. So we have time for a couple of questions before. Mukhtar.
Just a quick question. How much, given the stature of the institutions you work with, how much of this emergence or interest in acquiring, exhibiting art from the Middle East is accompanied by patrons who are from the Middle East who are actually providing the funding for this to take place? And imagine for a moment if those patrons who are primarily in the diaspora weren't around, would the institutions and the Board of Trustees still make it a priority to collect and interpret the works of the Middle East?
Well, I actually have worked in the Middle East as well as in the West. I've worked in the West. I started my career at South London Gallery, then worked at Tate Modern, and worked at Haus de Kultur und Gewalt in Berlin. But that was another aspect. Working for the last 7 years in the Gulf, I helped set up 2 organizations. One was Alan Art Space in Riyadh, which was the first curatorial space in Saudi Arabia, and secondly was Maraya Art Center in Sharjah, which was semi-governmental. So these 2 organizations were primarily funded within the region by patrons and private initiatives from the Arab world. So that was completely separate. So we didn't have any support from, like, for example, Goethe Institute, even if we had an international show. There was always the assumption that if you're in the region, then you are...
Maybe my question wasn't clear, sorry
Sorry.
to clarify. Is that the Western institutions, so Tate, Guggenheim, British Museum, Pompidou, etc., are currently relying mostly on the patronage from Middle Eastern collectors. And this is a relatively new phenomenon that has emerged in the last 10 years. My question is, how much of this curiosity and acquisition of art from the Middle East actually comes or is accompanied by the emergence of a class of people who are able to provide the resources needed for the museums? And had those people not existed, would the museum still make it a priority to acquire works of art from the region?
Well, in that case, my project is entirely funded by the UBS, which is a Swiss bank. So there is a great degree. And so there isn't any extra initiative. The reason I was answering your question reverse was because we have the same issue in the Gulf. If we want to bring a Western artist, for example, we have to fund it ourselves. There is no support. There's always the assumption that, you know, you have the ability, you have the funds to do that. But no, this project is entirely funded by UBS, but Guggenheim does have a Middle Eastern Acquisitions Committee. Mariam is also sits within that committee as well. So there is that aspect, but it's a double edge. You know, there is always an assumption that that these institutions will be entirely funded by that, but no, UBS is entirely funding this project. So obviously that shift has occurred, that they've recognized that.
I'd also add that that it's I think inspired a lot by patrons who may come from the Middle East or who have had experiences that have then led to this. But we should also acknowledge the main, you know, whether inspired by this or not, the fact that, you know, the art fund, which is something that anyone in the UK can apply for, it's government funding, that actually provided £50,000 to the British Museum and the V&A to collect photography from the Middle East, and that led, the product of that was led from the Middle East, so that was driven by collecting initiative. So there's that as well, and they've also, the V&A has just received funding to collect contemporary, what they call contemporary crafts, so craftsmen from the Middle East, and building a collection. Again, £50,000 has been allocated to that.
What you say about the tech content and then the acquisition committees? Mariam is the co-chair of the Middle East and African Acquisition Committee.
It's a common thing in Dubai.
And just to say that the support by the acquisition committees is actually covering or substituting a bigger problem, which is the lack of funding from the government. And that's a very big issue, particularly in the UK at the moment. At the same time, the individuals who support the committee are aware, and everybody's aware, that the works that are being acquired are becoming public property. So this is another really important and crucial thing to understand. And also the acquisitions are also being supported by our members, who are the people who are buying the cards to allow them to have like access to the galleries and to see the shows. Also by the International Council. So it's like it's many different. And we also support also the National Lottery continues supporting certain parts of acquisition processes. So it's a kind of like a mixture of forces, and I think there is a kind of like interest in continuing to advance the level and the kind of like the impact that art can have in society. And I do believe that these models would not stop existing, because these are the models that kind of like really pushing forward the way we kind of like save society today. And in that way, also the coexistence and the interconnections and the diversity of funding methods within an institution are also a guarantee that this model will not cease to exist. So kind of like will continue to evolve and diversify.
We'll take another.
I think we have one last question from a young member of our audience, a very curious young lady. So go ahead.
Are all of you based on the Middle East, or do you have, or are you based somewhere else?
That's a good question.
I didn't
Well, I think actually almost everyone is affiliated to a Western institution in some way, and actually one thing we didn't discuss, which maybe we could discuss for the later context of the day, is our roles working in Western institutions versus working at home, where you know, there is a dearth of knowledge production in context and institutions within the region as well, and that interrelationship should maybe be something that we discuss later. But I do know that Lisa's very keen for us to break, so I don't want to upset her. So thank you all so much to all the panelists.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks to our panelists.